Rain fell on the metal roof of the outpost, and Daniel Ross was on his knees in the mud, digging with his bare hands. Nobody had told him to do this. Nobody had asked him to save anything. But 5 eggs lay buried under a collapsed wall, and their mother was dead. Her name had been Rasktha, a dragon warrior who died 2 hours earlier defending the outpost from raiders who came in fast ships and left just as fast, after burning half the eastern wall down. Daniel had watched her fall from the workshop window, her wings torn open, her body hitting the ground so hard the windows shook. Nobody had time to grieve. There was too much to fix, too many wounded, too much smoke still rising into the grey sky. But Daniel had seen her nest before the attack. He knew where the eggs were, and when the fighting stopped, while dragon soldiers were treating their wounded and clearing debris, he ran toward the broken wall instead of away from it. He found the eggs under a slab of collapsed stone, unharmed but buried. He pulled the stone aside piece by piece, his hands bleeding, his shirt soaked with rain and sweat. One by one, he lifted the eggs out and wrapped them in his jacket. They were warm. That was a good sign. Dragon eggs went cold when the life inside them died. By the time a dragon patrol found him, he was sitting in the mud with all 5 eggs cradled against his chest, shielding them from the rain with his own body. The patrol leader, a stern soldier named Grath, stared down at him. "These eggs belong to no clan now," Grath said. "Their mother had no mate recorded, no bloodline guardian. By our law, they are forfeit. They will not survive without a proper caretaker, and no clan will claim orphaned eggs. It is our way." "Your way is wrong," Daniel said. He did not stand up. He did not let go of the eggs. Grath's eyes narrowed. "You are a human engineer. You have no authority here." "I don't need authority to keep something alive," Daniel said. "I just need to not let it die." Grath could have taken the eggs by force. Dragons were far stronger than humans, and Daniel was unarmed, exhausted, and covered in mud. But something in the way Daniel held those eggs, like they were the only thing that mattered in the world, made Grath hesitate. Dragons respected strength, yes, but they also respected devotion, even when it confused them. "You will answer for this," Grath finally said, and walked away. Daniel carried the eggs back to his quarters, a small metal room barely large enough for a bed and a desk. He built a makeshift nest out of blankets and spare heating coils from the workshop, keeping the eggs warm through the night. He did not sleep. He sat beside them, checking their temperature every hour, terrified that one wrong move would undo everything he had risked. The outpost commander, a human named Colonel Reyes, found out the next morning and was furious. "You do not have clearance for this, Ross," she said, standing in his doorway with her arms crossed. "This could start an incident with the Dominion. Dragon law on orphaned eggs is not something we get to ignore." "Then let them come take the eggs from me," Daniel said. "But I'm not handing over 5 lives because of paperwork." Reyes stared at him for a long moment. She had seen a lot of stubborn men in her years of service, but something about Daniel's exhaustion, his bleeding hands, the desperate care in his voice, made her soften. "I'll see what I can do to buy you time," she said quietly, "but I can't promise anything." Days passed. Daniel barely left his room, splitting his shifts in the workshop with hours spent tending the eggs, adjusting their warmth, talking to them even though he knew they couldn't hear him yet. Some of the human staff thought he had lost his mind. A few of the dragon staff thought he was mocking their traditions, but Daniel didn't care what anyone thought. He had made a promise to himself the moment he pulled those eggs from the rubble, and he intended to keep it. On the 7th night, the first egg cracked. Daniel was asleep in his chair when he heard it, a soft tapping sound, like a tiny hammer against stone. He shot awake and knelt beside the nest, watching as a small crack spread across the shell, then another, until a tiny claw pushed through. He held his breath as the hatchling broke free, wet and trembling, its eyes barely open. It made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a chirp, and turned its head toward him. Daniel didn't move. He didn't know what to do. Dragon hatchlings were supposed to imprint on their mother's scent within the first hour of life, but the mother was gone, and Daniel was the only living thing nearby. The hatchling crawled toward him on unsteady legs and pressed itself against his hand. Something in Daniel's chest cracked open, just like the egg had. He gently scooped the hatchling up, careful not to hurt it, and held it close. "Hey there," he whispered. "You're okay, I've got you." Over the following 2 nights, the other 4 eggs hatched, one after another, each hatchling finding its way to Daniel the same way the first had, crawling toward his warmth, his voice, his hands. By the 5th hatching, Daniel had 5 small dragons curled up against him, sleeping soundly for the first time since they had been pulled from their broken nest. He didn't know it yet, but what had just happened was something dragon scientists had always said was impossible. A human had become a guardian bond to 5 dragon hatchlings, and when the dragon elders found out, they would not be pleased. Word traveled fast on Drovakan, and within a week, the entire outpost knew what had happened in Daniel's quarters. Dragon scientists arrived from the capital city to study the hatchlings, and what they found shocked them. The 5 Barbies had bonded to Daniel the way hatchlings normally bonded to their birth mother. They followed his scent, calmed at the sound of his voice, and refused to eat unless he was in the room. This should not have been possible. Dragon biology experts had always taught that the guardian bond only formed with another dragon, something rooted deep in blood and instinct. A human bonding with hatchlings was considered a myth, a story told to younglings, never something that actually happened. But it had happened, and the elders did not know what to do with that. A council of senior dragons was called to decide the fate of the hatchlings. Daniel was not invited to speak. He stood outside the council chamber for 6 hours while dragons argued behind closed doors about whether the bond should be broken, whether it even could be broken, and what would happen to dragon society if humans learned they could claim dragon younglings as their own. When the doors finally opened, an elder named Sorvin stepped out and looked at Daniel with something between pity and disgust. "The council has decided," Sorvin said. "The hatchlings will be moved to the central brood facility on Caldris, where they will be raised properly among their own kind. You will not be permitted to accompany them." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "You can't just take them away. They need me. I'm their guardian." "You are their accident," Sorvin said coldly. "A biological error. The Dominion cannot allow this bond to continue. It sets a dangerous precedent." Daniel tried everything. He begged, he argued, he even offered to give up his position at the outpost and follow the hatchlings wherever they were sent, just to remain nearby. None of it mattered. 2 days later, armed guards arrived at his quarters while he was on shift in the workshop, and by the time he returned, the hatchlings were gone. He stood in the empty room for a long time, staring at the nest he had built with his own hands, now cold and abandoned. Reyes found him there hours later. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said. "I tried to stop it. The Dominion has full authority over dragon younglings. There was nothing I could do." "They're going to think I left them," Daniel said quietly. "They're going to think I just gave them up." He was right. On Caldris, the 5 hatchlings were placed in the care of the central brood facility, a massive structure filled with rows of nesting chambers and dozens of trained handlers. The handlers were kind enough, experienced in raising dragon younglings, but nothing about the transition went smoothly. The hatchlings would not eat. They pressed themselves into the corners of their new chambers and refused to respond to any handler's voice. At night, they made soft, mournful sounds that echoed through the facility, sounds the staff had never heard from hatchlings before. A senior handler named Vothra took a special interest in the 5. She had cared for hundreds of hatchlings over her long career, but she had never seen younglings behave this way. They searched every corner of their chamber, sniffing at the walls, the floor, the doorways, as if looking for something that wasn't there. "They're looking for their guardian," Vothra said to another handler one evening. "They think he's coming back." "He abandoned them," the other handler replied. "Humans do that. They get attached to something new, then they move on when it becomes inconvenient. It's in their nature." Vothra frowned but said nothing. She had heard this kind of talk before, old prejudice dressed up as fact, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. If the human truly abandoned them, why did the hatchlings still search so desperately for his scent, even weeks later? Meanwhile, far from Caldris, Daniel had not given up. He filed appeal after appeal through every official channel he could find, requesting visitation rights, requesting information on the hatchling's condition, requesting anything at all. Every request came back denied, often with no explanation given. He wrote letters, he called offices. He stood outside Dominion administrative buildings when he was granted leave from the outpost, waiting for hours just to speak to someone, anyone, who might listen. Most of the time, he was turned away before he even got through the front doors. Colonel Reyes watched him grow thinner, more exhausted, more desperate with each passing week, but she also watched him refuse to stop. "You know this might not work," she told him one night, finding him asleep at his desk, surrounded by rejected appeal forms. "I know," Daniel said without looking up, "but I'm not going to just let them think I left them, not without trying everything I have." Back on Caldris, the hatchlings grew weaker. They ate only when force-fed, slept only when exhausted, and stopped making any sound at all. The medical staff began to worry. Young dragons who lost their bonded guardian too soon sometimes developed a condition the older healers called bond sickness, a wasting illness rooted as much in grief as biology. It had no simple cure. Bothra sat outside their chamber one night, watching the 5 small shapes curled together in the dark, and made a quiet decision. She was going to find out exactly what had happened to their guardian, no matter what the official records said. Bothra had worked at the brood facility for over 30 years, long enough to know when something in the paperwork didn't add up. The official file on the 5 hatchlings said their human guardian had voluntarily relinquished contact shortly after their transfer to Caldris. But that single sentence bothered her more each time she read it. She started asking questions quietly, careful not to draw attention. She spoke to the transport crew who had moved the hatchlings from the outpost, and one of them mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the human guardian had been screaming for information at the loading dock, begging to know where they were being taken. That did not sound like someone who wanted to let go. Bothra requested the communication logs for the facility, official records of every message sent regarding the 5 hatchlings. It took 2 weeks and a fair amount of arguing with administration to get access, but when she finally sat down and read through them, her claws tightened on the edge of her desk. There were dozens of messages, appeal after appeal, all sent by someone named Daniel Ross. Requests for visitation, requests for health updates, requests just to know if the hatchlings were alive and well. Every single one had been marked, reviewed and denied by the same administrator, a mid-level Dominion official named Calvash. Bothra had worked under Calvash for 2 years. He was efficient, strict and cold, but she had never seen him personally intervene in a caretaking case like this. She dug further and found something worse. Several messages weren't marked denied at all. They were simply never forwarded to anyone. They sat unread in an internal queue, buried under Calvash's authority, as though he had made sure nobody else would ever see them. She brought her findings to him directly, sitting across from his desk, with a folder of printed records between them. "These messages were never reviewed," she said. "They were hidden. Why?" Calvash barely looked up from his own paperwork. The bond between that human and those hatchlings was a mistake from the beginning. It should never have been allowed to form. I was simply preventing further complications. "You lied to a grieving guardian," Bothra said. "You told him nothing for months, while 5 hatchlings wasted away believing he abandoned them." "They are dragons," Calvash said sharply. "Their well-being is not improved by clinging to a human scent. If anything, I have protected them from further attachment to a species that has caused enough damage to our people already." Bothra understood then. This was not about protocol. This was personal. She later learned through careful digging that Calvash had lost 2 brothers in the early conflicts between humans and dragons decades earlier, before the peace treaty had been signed. He had never forgiven humanity for that loss, and somewhere along the way, his grief had turned into quiet, buried hatred, one he expressed not through violence, but through small, deniable acts of sabotage. "You will not speak of this to anyone," Calvash said, his voice low and threatening. "If you push this further, I will make certain your career here ends. Nobody will believe an old handler's suspicions over an official Dominion record." Bothra left his office shaking, not from fear, but from anger. She had spent her whole life caring for dragon younglings, believing in the values her people claimed to hold: honesty, loyalty, protection of the vulnerable. What Calvash had done broke every one of those values, and he had done it while hiding behind the very system meant to enforce them. She spent the next several nights compiling everything: the communication logs, the transport crew's testimony, records of the unread messages, and a written account of her conversation with Calvash. She knew presenting this meant putting her entire career on the line. If the council decided she was wrong, or worse, if they decided she was making false accusations against a respected official, she would likely never work with dragon younglings again. But then she thought of the 5 hatchlings, curled together in their chamber every night, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, still searching for a guardian they believed had thrown them away. She thought of Daniel Ross, whoever he was, sending message after message into a void that swallowed every word he wrote. She made her decision. Vothra requested an emergency hearing with the Dominion's High Council, the highest authority on Drovakan, reserved for matters too serious for standard administrative review. It took considerable effort and no small amount of risk to even get the request approved, since accusing a sitting official of misconduct was not something done lightly. The council agreed to hear her case, but the head counselor, an old and weathered dragon named Threll, gave her a stern warning before the hearing date was even set. "Understand what you are asking for," Threll said. "If your accusations prove false, both you and this human will be permanently barred from any future involvement with dragon younglings, and Calvash will be well within his rights to pursue formal charges against you for slander. This is not a small risk you are taking." Vothra did not hesitate. "I understand, and I would rather lose everything telling the truth than keep it by staying silent." Threll studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The hearing will be held in 5 days. Bring your evidence, handler, and bring the human if you can find him." Vothra left the council chamber and immediately began the long process of tracking down Daniel Ross, hoping he had not yet given up entirely. Daniel was repairing a broken relay panel when a Dominion transport ship landed outside the outpost, its engines kicking up dust across the yard. He barely looked up. Dominion ships came and went for all sorts of reasons, and he had learned not to hope for anything good from them. Then Colonel Reyes came jogging across the yard, waving him over, and something in her face made him drop his tools and follow. "They're here for you," she said. "A hearing about the hatchlings." Daniel's heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack a rib. "What kind of hearing?" "I don't know all the details. Something about a handler named Vothra. She's been building a case, Daniel. She thinks someone buried your messages on purpose." He didn't ask any more questions. He grabbed his jacket and climbed aboard the transport before it could leave without him. The journey to the Dominion capital took almost a full day, and Daniel spent most of it staring out the small window, replaying every message he had sent, every appeal he had filed, wondering how many of them had simply vanished into nothing. He had assumed for months that the silence meant the Dominion simply didn't care about a human's request. He had never imagined someone had been deliberately hiding his words. When he arrived, Vothra met him at the landing platform. She was taller than he expected, with pale gray scales and tired eyes that still held a sharp intelligence. "Daniel Ross," she said, studying him carefully. "You look exactly like someone who has spent months fighting a war nobody told him he was in." "That's about right," Daniel said. She walked him through everything on the way to the council chamber: the buried messages, Calvash's role, the danger they were both in if the hearing went badly. Daniel listened in silence, his hands clenched at his sides, anger building with every detail. The council chamber was massive, built from dark stone with a domed ceiling that stretched high overhead. Rows of dragon officials sat in tiered seating around a central floor, and at the head of the chamber sat Threll, flanked by several other senior counselors. Calvash stood near the front, composed and confident, clearly certain of his own position. Daniel had never felt smaller in his life. The hearing began with Vothra presenting her evidence, laying out the communication logs one by one, showing the council the messages that had never been forwarded, the testimony from the transport crew, the timeline that proved Daniel had never stopped trying to reach his hatchlings. Kalvash responded calmly, exactly as Vothra had warned he would. The human formed an unnatural bond with dragon younglings, one our own biologists still cannot fully explain. I made the judgment that limiting further contact was in the best interest of the hatchlings' proper development among their own kind. This was a difficult decision, but not a malicious one. You hid his messages, Vothra said. You did not simply deny them. You buried them where no one else would find them. That is not caution. That is deception. A handler's opinion, Kalvash said dismissively, against a Dominion official's professional judgment. Threll raised a claw for silence, then turned to Daniel. The Council would like to hear directly from you, human. Why did you continue sending messages for months, long after every response you received was silence? Daniel stepped forward, his voice shaking at first, then steadying as he spoke. Because I made a promise to 5 eggs, I pulled out of a collapsed wall in the middle of a storm. I didn't do it because I understood dragon law or because I thought I had some kind of right to them. I did it because leaving them there felt wrong. Something helpless was about to be abandoned, and I couldn't just walk past that. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of dragons who had never once looked at him as anything other than an outsider. I don't know much about your traditions, I don't know your laws or your history, but where I come from, when you take responsibility for something living, you don't get to put it down just because it becomes complicated. I never stopped trying to reach them, not once. Every single day I wasn't with them felt like failing a promise I made the moment they hatched in my hands. The chamber fell silent. Even some of the older counselors, dragons who had spent centuries viewing humans with quiet suspicion, seemed genuinely moved by the raw simplicity of his words. Kalvash's composure finally cracked. This sentiment does not change the facts, he snapped, his voice rising. Humans are not meant to hold guardian bonds with our young. It goes against everything we know, everything our ancestors fought to protect after the wars. I did what was necessary to preserve. To preserve what? Threll interrupted sharply. Your own grief, dressed up as protocol. We are aware of your history, Kalvash. We are aware of what you lost. But grief does not grant you the right to hide the truth from a grieving guardian, nor to endanger 5 hatchlings in the process. Kalvash's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since the hearing began, he had no response. The chamber erupted into murmurs, counselors turning to one another, some in anger at Kalvash, others in quiet reflection on what they had just witnessed. Threll called for order, then looked down at Daniel with something that almost resembled respect. The council will deliberate, Threll said, but I believe, human, that we already know where the truth lies. Council deliberated for less than an hour, a surprisingly short time for a body known to argue over minor matters for days. When Threll returned to the chamber, his expression was grim but resolute. The council finds that Kalvash acted improperly, deliberately suppressing communication between a bonded guardian and 5 dragon hatchlings for personal reasons unrelated to their well-being. This is a serious violation of Dominion caretaking law. Threll turned toward Kalvash, who stood rigid, jaw clenched, refusing to look at anyone. You are stripped of your authority over caretaking matters, effective immediately. A full review of your prior decisions will follow. Kalvash said nothing. He simply turned and walked out of the chamber, guards falling into step behind him, his silence louder than any argument he could have made. Threll then turned to Daniel. As for the matter of guardianship, this council recognizes that the bond formed between you and the 5 hatchlings was genuine, and that your efforts to reach them were both consistent and sincere. We are ordering them brought here immediately, both to correct this injustice, and because their current medical condition requires urgent attention. Daniel's breath caught. Their condition. Vothra stepped forward, her expression tight with worry. They have not been eating properly for weeks. It's what we call bond sickness. It happens when young dragons lose contact with their guardian too early. I was hoping bringing you here in time would help. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain we could actually get you to them. Daniel felt sick with fear, but there was no time to dwell on it. Word was sent immediately to Caldris, and within hours, a transport arrived carrying the 5 hatchlings, escorted by 2 nervous handlers who looked relieved to be handing over their care. When the chamber doors opened and the small crate was carried in, Daniel's chest tightened painfully. The 5 hatchlings inside looked nothing like the healthy, wriggling creatures he remembered. They were thin, their scales dull, their eyes half closed, curled together in a tight, silent pile. The handlers set the crate down gently in the center of the chamber floor and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hatchlings didn't move. Daniel's heart sank, terrified that he had somehow arrived too late, that the damage had already been done. Then one of them, the smallest, lifted its head. Its nostrils flared, testing the air, and its half-closed eyes slowly widened. It let out a small, cracked sound, barely a chirp, and pushed itself unsteadily to its feet. "Hey," Daniel whispered, dropping to his knees beside the crate, his voice breaking. "Hey, it's me, I'm here." The hatchling scrambled forward, stumbling over its own siblings in its desperation to reach him, and the moment it caught his scent fully, it let out a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a roar, loud enough to fill the entire chamber. The other 4 hatchlings jolted awake almost instantly, heads snapping up, eyes locking onto Daniel. What happened next stunned every dragon in the room. All 5 hatchlings surged out of the crate at once, climbing over each other, tumbling across the stone floor, ignoring guards and counselors alike as they scrambled toward Daniel with a desperation that bordered on frantic. He barely had time to brace himself before they crashed into him, wrapping around his arms, his shoulders, pressing their small bodies against him as tightly as they could, making sounds no one in the chamber had ever heard hatchlings make before. Daniel wrapped his arms around all 5 of them as best he could, tears streaming down his face, whispering over and over that he was there, that he hadn't left, that he would never have left if they had just let him stay. The chamber, usually filled with the low murmur of formal proceedings, fell completely silent. Even the most hardened counselors, dragons who had fought in wars and made life or death decisions for centuries, stared at the sight before them with open shock. Some of the older dragons had tears in their own eyes, watching 5 hatchlings sob into the arms of a human they had been told, by their own society's laws, should never have been allowed to bond with them at all. Vothra stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside them. "I am sorry," she said quietly, to both Daniel and the hatchlings, though they were too overwhelmed to hear her. "I am sorry it took this long. I am sorry we let this happen." Threll rose from his seat at the head of the chamber, watching the scene with an expression none of the other counselors had seen on him before, something close to humility. "It seems," he said slowly, "that our laws were built on assumptions we never truly tested. Perhaps it is time that changed." Daniel, still surrounded by 5 trembling hatchlings clinging to every part of him, looked up at the council through tear-filled eyes. "I never stopped coming for them," he said, his voice raw but steady. "Not for one single day. I just needed someone to finally let me through." The chamber remained silent for a long moment, 5 small dragons breathing softly against him, finally calm, finally home. 6 months later, the outpost looked almost the same as it always had, weathered metal walls, dusty landing pads, the same grey sky Daniel had grown used to over the years. But inside his quarters, everything had changed. The room that once held a single narrow bed now held a much larger nest, built properly this time with materials approved by dragon caretaking specialists, along with 5 young dragons who had nearly doubled in size since their reunion. They were no longer the fragile, wasting hatchlings pulled from a crate in the council chamber. Their scales had regained their color, their eyes were bright and alert, and their appetite, much to Daniel's exhausted amusement, had become nearly impossible to satisfy. Daniel had been granted something no human had ever received in Dominion history: formal guardianship rights over dragon younglings, recognized fully under Drovakan law. The council, still shaken by what had happened in that chamber, had moved quickly to rewrite outdated regulations, establishing new protections for cross-species guardian bonds and strict penalties for anyone who attempted to interfere with them the way Calvash had. Calvash himself had been quietly reassigned to a distant administrative post far from any position involving younglings of any kind. It was not the harsh punishment some had called for, but it was enough to remove his influence entirely, and most who had worked under him considered that its own kind of justice. Vothra visited often. What had started as a professional investigation had turned into something closer to friendship, and eventually something the young dragons themselves seemed to understand as family. She had lost her old position at the Caldris facility, unwilling to work under an administration that had allowed Calvash's actions to go unchecked for so long. But she had been offered something far better, a newly created role advocating for guardian rights across the Dominion, a position that existed specifically because of what had happened to Daniel and his 5 hatchlings. "They've grown so much," she said one afternoon, watching the 5 young dragons wrestle playfully in the yard outside Daniel's quarters, their wings still too small for real flight, but strong enough for short, clumsy hops that sent them tumbling into each other with delighted squawks. "Tell me about it," Daniel said, rubbing at a fresh scorch mark on his sleeve where the smallest one had accidentally sneezed a small burst of flame during breakfast. "I go through twice as much food as I used to, and half my clothes have scorch marks now." Vothra let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound Daniel had learned meant genuine amusement among dragons. "Small price to pay, I imagine." "Small price," Daniel agreed, watching the 5 of them tumble across the yard. He had never regretted a single moment of it, not the exhaustion, not the appeals that had once felt endless, not even the months of silence that had nearly broken him. Every difficult day had led to this one. News of what happened had spread far beyond the outpost. Other Dominion worlds had begun re-evaluating their own outdated caretaking laws, and a handful of similar guardian bonds, some human, some other species entirely, had come forward once they realized such bonds were no longer something to be hidden or punished. Daniel had unknowingly become something of a symbol, proof that compassion did not need to follow the boundaries of species or tradition to be real. He never asked for any of that attention, and mostly avoided it when he could, more interested in keeping 5 growing dragons fed, healthy, and out of trouble than in any kind of recognition. But when the Dominion announced a formal ceremony to mark the 1-year anniversary of the outpost attack that had first brought the 5 eggs into his care, he agreed to attend, mostly because the 5 hatchlings insisted on it in their own chaotic, excitable way. The ceremony was held outdoors, in a wide plaza near the Dominion capital, filled with dragons and humans alike, a mixture that would have seemed impossible to imagine only a year earlier. Threll himself spoke, formally recognizing Daniel as the first human clan guardian in Drovakan history, a title that came with both honor and a fair share of new responsibility. As Threll finished his speech, the 5 young dragons, no longer content to sit quietly through a long ceremony, leapt into the air together, wings working hard against the wind, circling above the plaza in short, wobbling loops before settling directly around Daniel, wings half spread as though shielding him from the crowd, their heads held high with obvious pride. The crowd, human and dragon alike, broke into applause, and even Threll allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. Daniel stood there, surrounded by the 5 dragons who had once believed, in their darkest, weakest moments, that he had simply thrown them away. Dragons who now understood, deep in whatever place dragons kept such things, that they had never been abandoned at all. They had been fought for every single day by someone who refused to give up no matter how many doors were closed in his face. And as the applause continued around them, one of the young dragons nudged its head gently against Daniel's shoulder, a small, simple gesture that meant more than any speech or title ever could. He wrapped his arms around as many of them as he could reach, and for the first time in a very long while, felt like everything, finally, was exactly where it belonged.